you're an Israeli settler, an Israeli citizen, living in the West Bank, you have the benefit and privilege of Israeli authorities applying Israeli civilian law, which comes with enhanced protections, generally meets international standards. But if you're Palestinian, right, the law that applies to you is subpar.
الترمانين بريف إدلب الشمالي. هذا المخيم بيحتوي على أرامل وأيتام شهداء حصراً.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. Last week, the story broke that the Israeli government decided to brand the major Palestinian human rights organizations as terrorist organizations, something that even Netanyahu didn't do. We've worked with one of those groups, Defense of Children International Palestine, for some time. Their so-called terrorism is highlighting the crimes of apartheid against children. To give you a sense of what's going on, I'm going to read an open letter by a number of Israelis who call themselves Israelis Against Apartheid. We Israeli citizens stand in absolute solidarity with Palestinian human rights groups and their admirable work for justice in the face of the recent attack on their existence and their labeling as terror organizations. Like every colonial regime, crushing the colonized civil society has been a cornerstone of Israeli policy since its creation, both within the 1948 borders and in the territories it occupied in 1967. Criminalizing any form of dissent and resistance by indigenous Palestinians by labeling them as terrorists, while at the same time calling its own colonial practices of oppression and dispossession self-defense, is essential in order to sustain Israel's settler apartheid system. Shamefully, this pro-colonial discourse has been adopted by many foreign politicians and journalists. Recent attempts by Benny Gantz to silence organizations like Al-Haq are documenting and reporting on the war crimes committed by the Israeli occupation forces he himself commands, Defense for Children International Palestine, who have demonstrated Israel's widespread abuse of children, or Basan, who collects data and provides information on Israel's criminal activity. All this amounts to a clear attempt to obstruct justice and a war crime investigation against Israeli war criminals. I'll skip down to the end. We support the call by Palestinian organizations to the international community to take actions to rescind Israel's absurd designations. There's more to the letter. We'll put that up on our website, thestruggle.org. What follows is a bit of a talk by Brad Parker, a lawyer who works for Defense of Children International Palestine, in 2019 in Woodbridge, Connecticut.
What I'm going to talk about sort of briefly before Farah comes up to share her experience representing and defending Palestinian children in the Israeli military courts is I want to just give sort of an overarching context to military detention. We have a short 8-minute film, some of you have maybe seen already. We wanted to play that again just because we always try to include children's voices in the work that we do. They're the ones being impacted. We want to highlight the human impact of occupation and bring you their voices. So we'll play that. But first, sort of thinking about the legal context. You have 3 lawyers. Well, Shayna needs to do our bar paperwork, but 3 lawyers. So the legal piece is very much a component of DCI Palestine's work. The context that of the legal framework that applies throughout the Palestinian territory, occupied Palestinian territory, is important because it's very much the legal arm of facilitating occupation and oppression. So kind of the overarching piece that we always want people to sort of understand before we get into things deeper is that Israeli military law, right? Israeli forces occupied the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip in 1967. When they did so, they instituted a military law system. So military law applies to any person located in the occupied Palestinian territory. In practice, Israeli authorities only apply military law to the Palestinian population. So if you're an Israeli settler, an Israeli citizen, living in the West Bank, you have the benefit and privilege of Israeli authorities applying Israeli civilian law, which comes with enhanced protections, generally meets international standards. But if you're Palestinian, right, the law that applies to you is subpar according to international standards. So the basic framework of sort of everything that we will discuss starts with this disparity and hierarchy of rights based on a person's identity. The other sort of important piece to know is that Israel is unique because they are the only country in the world that automatically and systematically prosecutes kids in military courts. Under international standards, customary international law, things that all states, all actors are bound by, all activity related to a child should be, the primary consideration should be the best interest of that child. Along with that, sort of an extension of that, is that detention must always be a measure of last resort. It is never, rarely, close to never, in a child's best interest to be detained, separated from their families, held in a custodial detention situation. That's obvious generally to everybody. But what we have in the Israeli military detention system, pretrial detention, custodial detention is the norm. Bail is rarely provided. If a child gets bail, it's usually the younger children, 12 to 13 years old. But the majority of children detained by Israeli forces do not get bail. Right? They get detained and they're in pretrial detention. And that period could be anywhere from a few days to a few weeks to several months, depending on their age. So the significance of kind of the disregard for these basic fundamental protections that exist in international law, right, I think is just completely systematic and intentional, right, by Israeli forces. So I'll stop there. I want to play this 8-minute film so we can see and hear from Obaida. Kind of a note on Obaida. Farah was his attorney. Farah has sort of over the past year represented a number of the more high-profile cases. So Fauzi here in this photo, which people have probably seen on social media. This is Fauzi al-Junaidi, Farah's other client, which maybe she'll talk more about. So let's meet Obaida.
أول شيء بدأت أفكر كيف بدي أطلع، كيف بدي أمشي أيامي، تحسك إنك لو جيت جوا كنت منعزل عن العالم خارجي تماما. عندك خوف إنك تنسجن كمان مرة ولا كيف؟ تعرف شو المشكلة الرئيسية؟ خط ستير، إنه بس كيف تقطع وتكون جوا المخيم، لأنه عند خط ستير هم ملك الشارع. أنا عبيد أكرم جوابنا، مخيم العروب. شمال الخليل، عمري تقريبا 15 سنة وبحب أطبخ. عندك مخيم العروب كل دور صغيرة وعدد الأفراد اللي فيها كبير كثير ومساحة الدور صغيرة وحتى إنه الشباك مثلا بفتح على شباك جارك يعني الحد في الحد زي ما يسموها. وعندك طرق صغيرة وعندك برضو الناس فيها كثير طيبين كثير مناح جدعان بوقفوا معك المشاكل. فيش حياة الأطفال مأساوية. لا في ألعاب زي العالم، لا في حرية. تم اعتقالي مرتين من قبل الاحتلال. عندي كانت تجربة أولى مأساوية جدا. حتى كنت أنا ماشي أروح على الدكان أشتري، اعتقلوني. لما اعتقلوني في مركز التحقيق حطوا لي كلبش بلاستيك، كلبشتين نفس الشيء في نفس الإيد. حتى كان دي كنت بقدرش حركة دي لا فوق ولا تحت. كان يحطوا له عصبة خليلة وحتى حطوها لمنخاري ما تقدرش تتنفس بصعوبة. تعرف لما تمشي أنت مش شايف إشي طريق غريب ضلك ماشي وضلك في شيء دايخ وخايف وتردد. حتى هم كانوا نقول لي انزل الدرج مبقاش في درج.
About a month ago, the offices of DCIP were raided, and the Israelis stole computers and files. This was obviously a preparation for this now terrorist designation. This is not original. It follows the old game plan in apartheid South Africa. It just has a few new twists. 7 or so progressive members of the U.S. Congress have sponsored a resolution to condemn Israel for its attack on Palestinian human rights groups. Call your member of Congress and ask him or her to join in. Tell them to find the new Betty McCollum bill. From Syria, Hadi al-Abdallah explains how the regime is outdoing itself in brutality by bombing a camp of widows and orphans.
على ما يبدو يا جماعة أن نظام الأسد عم ينافس نفسه بالإجرام. بعد مجزرة أطفال أريحة اللي استشهدوا وهن رايحين على المدرسة قبل كم يوم، قام نظام الأسد قبل قليل باستهداف مخيم الدوماني في بلدة ترمانين بريف إدلب الشمالي. هذا المخيم بيحتوي على أرامل وأيتام شهداء حصرا. تم استهداف هذا المخيم بعدة قذائف وصواريخ مما أدى لسقوط شهداء وجرحى. حتى اللحظة ما في إحصائية دقيقة للشهداء والجرحى حتى الأسف. قامت عناصر الدفاع المدني بانتشال الشهداء والجرحى من تحت هاي الأنقاض وإسعافهم للمشافي. حتى الشهداء حتى أبناء الشهداء وزوجات الشهداء لم يسلموا من هذا الإجرام. ما بنعرف شو هي العبرة من قصف مخيم آمن ما بيحتوي غير نساء وأطفال من قبل نظام الأسد. على ما يبدو أنه رسائل الدم مستمرة، مستمرة بدم أهلنا، بدم إخوتنا، بدم أبنائنا، وللأسف ردات الفعل عم تكون باردة من الكل، من الفصائل ومن الدول ومن الكل. ومع الأسف نظام الأسد عم يستمر بهاي المجازر لأن ما في حدا يرده.
I wish we had better news on Syria to tell you. As we record, British judges are hearing and deciding on Julian Assange's fate. The publisher revealed U.S. war crimes in Afghanistan and Iraq. And so U.S. leaders want him put in jail forever. Last year, a British judge ruled that conditions in U.S. prisons were so appalling that Assange should not be sent to the United States. But the Biden administration is appealing that ruling. Assange has not been given bail and still is in prison. In Britain, these are signs from a protest near the court. One mentions that a key witness against Assange has admitted to lying.
We now have confirmed that there were plans to kidnap Julian here in the center of London, or even assassinate him. How is it possible for this country to extradite Julian to the state that made these plans? Of course, it is impossible. That is what we're going to hear in the courts here today, and let's hope that it will be heard and it will be taken into account, and at the end of the day, this court will throw out this case entirely. Thank you.
Saudi Arabia is the only country in the world named after its ruling tyrants. From Saudi family-occupied Arabia, some good news. The release of a man after 10 years in prison, a member of the illustrious Al-Nimr family. He had been locked up for 10 years for the crime of protesting the regime. This week, a military coup overthrew the government of Sudan. A Zoom panel will take place on October 31st at 3 p.m. Eastern. Look on Facebook for Sudan Resists the Coup. And now for some video of thousands marching in Sudan against the military takeover.
You see, we're never alone. Our martyrs are always with us, just like our silhouette walking beside us. This was the biggest million-man march since the revolution. Every village, town, city, state, and the whole nation came under one identity. And so, here we are, standing before you as a nation. We are not asking for your money or your hand-me-downs. We are not even asking for the reconciliation of our past. Our loved ones, the martyrs who gave their lives in the name of this revolution. So many faces from different generations, side by side, carrying our flags, waving them high. You can see the people shout and hear their demands. We will never allow for another military coup and pave the way for another dictatorship to rise. We march here today for our freedom and took over the streets with our message perfectly clear. No to military rule. No to usurpers of our great revolution. And no to going back to the old ways that led us here in the first place. We are all living in this land. Our tongues and skin tones may differ, but I promise you this: we are united under one banner, our love for this country, our love for Sudan.
Back in February, President Biden's climate chief, John Kerry, said we had just 9 years left to avoid climate catastrophe. Now in October, we have even less time. This Saturday, October 30, a number of groups will rally and march at the Capitol building in Hartford. It will take place on these north steps of the Capitol from 2 to 4 p.m. The emphasis again is on fighting environmental racism. Ever notice that they put the power plants and factories with dirty waste in low-income areas, often ones home to minorities? That's environmental racism, and it's got to stop. But it won't, because the politicians are just doing business as usual. Big promises, and then cave-ins to the fossil fuel industry. A first step would be to cancel the killingly fracked gas plant that's slated to be built in the poorest county of Connecticut. It's up to us to turn the heat on, the heat of anger and protest. Now, the October 30 event is not going to be just more of the usual. There's only going to be 3 speakers from the podium. Instead, there'll be guerrilla theater, mural art making, and most of all, a march led by Ajali, an Afro-Caribbean and West African drumming group. So rain or shine, come out to the rally at 2 o'clock on Saturday. The world is depending on you. It appears that the president has rounded up all 50 Democratic senators to agree on budget matters, including expenditures of $500 billion on climate preservation. Mostly, it's about tax credits for sustainable electricity and $100 billion to build walls and other things to protect the U.S. from rising seas. However, there's nothing in the legislation that will limit the burning of fossil fuels. In a sense, it's Obama's all of the above strategy 2.0. The details are still coming out, but I'll just quote Mitch Jones, Policy Director of Food and Water Watch. Given the prime opportunity to cancel billions of dollars in domestic subsidies for oil and gas polluters, the president and congressional leadership have rolled over. A climate plan that fails to directly confront the oil and gas industry cannot possibly be considered meaningful. And believe it or not, some good climate news. In New York State, their Department of Environmental Conservation denied permits for 2 massive fracked gas power plants, one that was going to go up in Astoria, Queens, the other in Newburgh. You know, this came about only after years of hard work by climate activist organizations. We wish that Connecticut, where we record this program, had a government that was responsive to health and climate issues. Instead, they build gas plant after gas plant. This 70-foot banner was unveiled on October 28th by Rainforest Action Network, a week before the COP26 Climate Summit, where the politicians will get together for the latest edition of Too Little, Too Late. We've talked about Promoting Enduring Peace's big proposal to try to avoid climate collapse by gradually banning burned fuel use, to ration what we have to burn, and to have enormous amounts of land rewilding. But now take a look at a smaller PEP proposal to follow California and ban the sale of small gas-powered gardening machines, things that give an outsized portion of pollution and greenhouse gases. 10 years ago, Edmunds, the auto site, wrote, "The hydrocarbon emissions from a half hour of yard work with the 2-stroke leaf blower are about the same as a 3,900-mile drive from Texas to Alaska in a Ford 150 Raptor." And now from Democracy Now!, part of a segment of a couple weeks ago, right after the Iraqi elections. An interview with an Iraqi named Nabil Saleh, who remarks on the hundreds of protesters killed by that Iraqi government in recent years.
Al-Sadr has called for the withdrawal of all U.S. troops and is a longtime critic of neighboring Iran. His armed movement has also been accused of kidnapping and killing its critics, reportedly including a 17-year-old boy ahead of the parliamentary election. Sunday's vote was held several months ahead of schedule, triggered by youth-led massive protests that drew tens of thousands of Iraqis to the streets in late 2019. In early 2020, denouncing corruption, unemployment, the worsening living conditions in Iraq, security forces violently cracked down on the anti-government protests, killing over 600 demonstrators and injuring thousands more. Our next guest was at the demonstrations himself. Nabil Saleh is an Iraqi journalist and photographer from Baghdad, now a graduate student at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. His most recent article for Middle East Eye is headlined, "Iraq's streets are littered with the memories of our dead." Nabil Saleh, it's wonderful to have you with us. Thank you for joining us. Can you start off by talking about the significance of Muqtada al-Sadr's victory, and then talk about the condition of your country, still occupied by the United States?
Good morning, Amy. Thank you for having me. And, well, thanks to the United States of America, every government that ruled Iraq after the barbaric invasion and occupation of 2003 has either killed or failed miserably in protecting Iraqis. So Muqtada al-Sadr is no different. In fact, the protesters on the ground, as reported by both local and international media, remember all too well that his followers, during the October uprising that started in October 2019, have not only stabbed activists, but also shot at them, for example, in Najaf and Karbala. And of course, that is all dormant because as a powerful guy who has his own militia, it is not easy to touch him. So imagine, and of course, let's not forget the role Jaish al-Mahdi, his militia, played and what our colleagues in the Western media like to call a civil war. Yes, Jaish al-Mahdi terrorized and abducted and displaced Iraqis, and now, apologies, now the same guy will, had the most seats in this election. So, I fear for the future of Iraq, not only that the previous men in suits were any better, for example, take Mustafa al-Kadhimi, who is a favorite of Western media. People still got killed and abducted, assassinated, and terrorized during his brief, his tenure. So yes, I think I will quote Muhammad Mahdi al-Jawahiri, the greatest Arabian poet, by saying, "I see a horizon lit with blood, and many a starless night. A generation comes, another goes, and the fire keeps burning."
That's our program for today. If you see this before the 30th, please do come out to the rally in Hartford about the climate at the Capitol, and PEP will have some candy for you if you come to their table. That's it. Have a good one. This is Stanley Heller for The Struggle.